So we've been looking at some literary themes, but another way to look at these passages is through a literary reading. One of the things that you don't learn in seminary is how to read a book. You don't learn some of the great literature, applicational things when we read. And the New Testament writers, and even the Old Testament writers as well, they're very aware of literature. They're very aware of painting a picture. Because remember, this is not a society that gets to read books like you and me, or has an iPad or an iPhone where we can read. This is more of an oral society where they're hearing these things. And in hearing these stories, there are pictures being painted. And I want to be able to tap into them. Let me show you here an example of how to look at things through a literary reading, not just through literary themes, but through a literary reading. So in Mark 2, we're told that Jesus, this is Jesus here, when he returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. Jesus was a really popular teacher. Wherever he went, the crowds would come, and rightly so, because people knew that he had a tendency to heal people. He had a tendency to do miracles, and people like to be around things that are happening. And Jesus was a happening person. And so he's come home, and they realized that. It says, and many were gathered together, so that there was no more room. This is important here. No more room, not even at the door. So and again, these first century houses are not big. If you've ever been to Israel, you'll see. I mean, so it's not like, we think of like maybe a house on the water or something where it's got, multiple thousands of square feet. These are not houses that are that big. But there was a group of people there that had come around. They were in the house. There was no room at the door, and he was preaching the word to them. And they came bringing him a paralytic carried by 4 men. Now that's important, because the Greek word does not have a word. The Greek does not have a word for quadriplegic. It only has a word for paralytic. And this guy was obviously a paralytic because, quadriplegic, all limbs and arms, because not only did he stand in the latter part of this passage, but he also took up his bed, which the use of his arms. So I think this is a quadriplegic. He's laying on a sort of a flat area. He can't move. He looks like he's dead. And he's carried by 4 men. I want you to see the literary thing that's going on here. You have a man being carried by 4 people at each end. Looks very much like pallbearers carrying a dead man. The fact that he's 4 men, he could just say he was carried by some men. It doesn't have to be 4, but the reason that he's written 4 is because there's a picture that Mark is wanting to create in people who hear this story. So we have this man who is immobilized, who's being carried by 4 men to a house that they can't get in because Jesus is at home and everybody's there. And when they could not get near him because of the crowd, and I'll just make a note here, in Mark, whenever you read the word crowd, the crowd is always keeping people from Jesus. That's a Markan theme when you're reading Mark. Everybody's got different themes, but Mark's got this theme. The crowd's always keeping people from Jesus. So couldn't get near the crowd, and they removed, this actually is to dig. They dug through the roof above him. Now, can you imagine that scene? Got people in the house, Jesus is teaching, and all of a sudden they start digging through the mud and through the thatch to open up the roof. And it says, and when they had made an opening, they let down the bed on which the paralytic lay. I want you to imagine this scene. 4 people carrying this person who's immobilized, who looks like he's dead because he can't move. Can't get into the house. So they go up on top of the house and they dig through the thatch and the mud, creating a hole to lower this man down into the house. The literary thematic way to read this is Mark is basically recounting to us in a story way of what we would consider to be a funeral, where someone's being carried that's dead. You have to dig in the ground, and you lower them down into the ground. Now, of course, if you continue to read the story, who's down there in the house? Well, it's Jesus. And what does Jesus say? He says, rise, which is beautiful. And then he says, take up your mat, take up your cot with his hands. And what's the point here? The point here is that Mark is giving us a literary theme to teach us about resurrection. It's not just resurrection here, but it's also implicitly in here in the literary account account of death. Oftentimes, this can be used at a funeral when you have allowed the person to go to the graveside and you're lowering them into the ground. You can say, just like the paralytic was lowered into the ground, he too will meet Jesus and will be told, resurrect. Now, here's the other little hidden gem in this passage, and I want you to see this. When he returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. And many were gathered together. There's no more room, not even the door. And he was preaching the word to them. And they came bringing to him a paralytic carried by 4 men. And when they could not get near him because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him. And when they had made an opening, they let down the bed on which the paralytic lay. Here's the beauty. Mark wants you and me to make sure that we know that this text is about Jesus. Pay attention when you read these texts, because oftentimes there's a lot more going on than we see.